if you are not already giving yourself the nourishing love that you need when your partner is expressing love to somebody else, whatever you're already not feeling is just going to compound. So, really take responsibility for providing the love that you need within the relationship. Don't put it on your partner.
Hi everyone, welcome to Polysecure. I am Fair, host of this podcast. Today, I had the pleasure to chat with Jess and Zach. Jess is a trauma-centered relationship coach and a plant medicine guide, and Zach is a breathwork facilitator and a men's intimacy coach. Together, they have the Sacred Ships podcast, where I joined as a guest last year. I love today's conversation because both Jess and Zach are the kind of people who are really willing to put the hard work to improve themselves and their relationships. And today you'll hear about their whole evolution from being monogamous and going through a very tumultuous time to getting engaged, to them breaking up and getting back together to open up their relationship. Although note that this interview was recorded about half a year ago, so I'm sure things have changed since then. In our conversation, we also talk about how they both experienced sexual assault when they were teenagers and about how they learned to heal, partly through their relationship. Zach opens up about how this trauma led him to use porn in a way that actually affected his sexual performance, and about all the self-work that he had to do to get to a comfortable place with his sexuality. And having casual sex with other women and opening up their relationship was actually an important part of this process. Overall, I think their story really shows how relationships can really grow and evolve if and only if people are willing to really work on themselves. I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. Here's my interview with Jess and Zach. Welcome, guys, to Polycurious. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, especially after being on your podcast and also just listening to your podcast called Sacred Ships, which everyone should go and check out. But yeah, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourselves to the listeners who haven't had the privilege to get to know you yet?
My name is Zach. I am 31 years old from San Diego, California, and I am a men's embodiment coach, one half of Sacred Ships with my partner, Jessica, and learning how to be in an open relationship each day.
And then I am Jessica. I am also a coach. I do plant medicine work with people and also really focus on trauma healing and nervous system regulation. And then together, we do relationship coaching with couples.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your backgrounds? I believe, Jess, that you grew up religiously. I don't know if that's the case with Zach, but how did you guys come across the concept of non-monogamy, or when did you start even knowing that that existed?
So I also grew up religious, not as religious as Jess. I didn't grow up in a Catholic school, but I grew up very sheltered, and I was never like really exposed to sex. I grew up without my dad around. It was just me and my mom. And anytime there was like a sex scene on TV, it was that awkward moment where it's like, oh, I'm going to go to the bathroom and get out of this situation as quickly as possible. So my introduction to sex, like so many young men these days, was through porn. And my first sexual experience that I ever had was unwanted. It was by an older girl in high school, and it really scarred me and left a lasting imprint on every sexual encounter thereafter. And basically what would happen is anytime I had the opportunity to become physically intimate with a woman, I would just shut down. Like my body would shut down. I suffered from performance anxiety. I would not be able to get hard. I would start profusely sweating. My heart would be out of my chest. So all throughout my teenage years and my 20s, up until I met my ex-wife, I was kind of scared of sex and scared of being intimate with other women, because I was like, my body's just going to not allow this to happen. And it was extremely embarrassing for me. I met my ex-wife when I was 21. We got married at 25, and I was in that relationship until I was 28. So basically, all throughout my 20s, I was with one single partner, and she was also very conservative. Our sex life after a while became very monotonous, very boring. And eventually it got to the point to where I wasn't even really interested in sex, and I was constantly going back to porn because it was just a safer option. Uh, at least for me, it felt like a safer option. I didn't have to deal with any sort of performance anxiety. We went through a divorce in 2020. And when we went through that divorce, I knew there was a multitude of things that I wanted to work on. But the biggest thing was this sexual relationship with myself, because I had looked back at that relationship, and I was just like, I'm in great shape. I'm a good looking guy. I'm young. I'm in like the prime of my life. And it's like, why do I have this relationship with sex? So from there, I just started picking up like Taoist sexual practices and really kind of rewiring my brain. I cut out porn. I began being a little bit more open to being embarrassed in sexual situations, knowing that it was an opportunity to grow and learn about myself. And eventually I just got to the point to where I was very open about my past sexual trauma with other women. And having that conversation just really allowed me to be a more sexual being. When I met Jess, she just made me feel so comfortable in my own body. I think our relationship like really healed a lot of those sexual traumas that I was carrying for over a decade at that point. And from there, because I was more comfortable in my own body, I was much more willing to be more sexually explorative, both with myself and with Jess. But I had never even really considered being open or non-monogamous until I met Jess, and she just kind of opened up Pandora's box. And yeah, I'll kind of let her take it from there.
Yeah, before we go into that, because I do have a lot of questions and comments about what you just
Yeah.
said. First of all, thank you for opening up about that. I feel like we hear, especially a lot more these days, about sexual abuse done to women, but it also
Hmm.
happens to men. And I'm sorry that, you went through that experience. It sounds like at a young age. And, as you said, the more open you were about it, the better you were able to deal with it. And not only that, but also you were like, okay, I'm going to actually do something about it. So I'm also
Hmm.
curious, like, if we have listeners out there who might also have some sort of sexual trauma, what is it that you did to overcome that? You mentioned being more vulnerable. You mentioned, so did you say Tao practices?
Yeah, Taoist sexual
Tao. What's
practices.
that?
Hmm.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Taoist sexual practices, the most common uh, practice that you'll hear about is either like semen retention or edging, where you masturbate, but you don't masturbate to as the goal of being an orgasm. It's just to kind of circulate sexual energy within your body, and you're really just focusing on your breath and your energy. You're not creating some sort of fantasy inside your head. And as somebody who, was more comfortable watching porn than actually having sex with my partner, that was extremely difficult to start because I used to need so much visual stimulation in order to turn myself on. So, uh, and I would say like Spark Notes, Taoist sexual practices is kind of like the art of turning yourself on with no other stimulants.
So you took that upon yourself as a challenge to practice that without watching porn. And did that
Mhm.
did that help?
Yeah, it took a while. It took a few months. And when I say it took a few months, like it didn't take a few months to kind of develop the practice, but it did take a few months for it to transfer over to actually having sex with a woman, because it's very different. I think a lot of I feel like there is a certain amount of pressure that men put on ourselves to perform. And when you deal with that, it takes you out of your body and into your head. And that's a really difficult pattern to get out of once it's started. So definitely be patient with yourself, because it's going to take a while, especially if you've been watching porn for 10, 15, 20 years. And I don't want to necessarily demonize porn, but it was, at that time of my life, it was not helping me whatsoever. And it was severely hindering my sexual growth.
Yeah, and I've heard that from other guys as well, that porn ruins their sexual experiences in a way. And I'm wondering, I mean, this is my theory, is that is because they start thinking of porn as real sex, like they start expecting what they see in porn in real life, and then it becomes a little disappointing because maybe not every woman they sleep with has huge boobs and wants to spend 20 minutes giving them a blowjob, or whatever it is
Mhm.
that they see, right? I don't know if
Right.
I'm right about that, or why do you think that watching porn affected the way you related to women?
I think what you just said is very true for a lot of men. For me personally, and I don't want to speak for all men that have gone through some sort of sexual abuse, but for me personally, it was a way to cultivate sexual energy that had very low stakes. Anytime I put myself out there, went on a date, and like went home with a woman, like the date would go well, the kissing would go well, and then the second we got into the bedroom and I knew we were going to have sex, or at least be, intimate with one another, I would shut down, and I would get so nervous that, again, I wouldn't be able to perform. And I just hated being in that situation. So for me, porn was like just this, it was a safety blanket. It was really, I felt like, the only safe place for me to come.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, actually, that makes sense as well. Because it's not just the expectations you have on the person you're having sex with, it's also the
Hmm.
expectations you have on yourself, right? But it's
Exactly.
again, it's this idea of thinking that porn is real sex. And I think that I don't think there's anything wrong about porn, but yeah, I think that it's important for people to know that it's staged, right? Like that's
Hmm.
not real sex, and that's not how real sex needs to be. That's not how you need to perform.
Right.
There's also a pretty substantial amount of research that shows that basically the more porn you watch, it desensitizes you. And so just from a like chemical perspective, whenever we do anything for instant gratification, it gives us like a dopamine hit. And so it sort of trains our system to like have these really high peaks and then crashes and then peaks and crashes. What it can do is create this like constant need for more. And so the type of porn you're watching also tends to progress depending on like how you're engaging with it and how often you're engaging with it. So that like what you guys are already saying about people expecting what they're seeing in porn in real life, it's like what they're even watching in porn is escalating and escalating and escalating because what they started watching is no longer giving them the same dopamine hit that it once was. And so then with that constant escalation scale, it's like real sex could never compare, even though it maybe once could with the porn that they once were watching.
Yeah. Last question about this, and we we can move on to you, Jess. But it's like, and it's okay if you don't want to share this, but what's your relationship to porn at the moment? Are you still abstaining from it, or do you feel like now that you've, in a way, healed yourself, you're able to re-engage with it in a different way?
Yeah, I am re-engaging with it in a very different way now. I abstained from it for a very, very long time. And then when Jess and I opened our relationship and I started to have uh, multiple sexual experiences with different women on a somewhat frequent basis, I was just kind of interested in like the world of kink, and what turned me on, and kind of like what different kinks looked like. And a lot of people would be like, yeah, that's bullshit, but I kind of felt like I was like studying, like I was I was doing my homework. um
Totally.
yeah, so yeah, I have a very different relationship with it now. I use it very sparingly. You know, sometimes I will go weeks, months without watching it, and then all day will come up and be like, you know what? I really want to watch porn. And I watch it and I masturbate, and it doesn't deplete me the way it normally does. I actually like feel good afterwards. And then it's like, okay, I did it, and it doesn't have to be a consistent part of my life now. Before I move on, the one thing I do want to say is men that have been sexually assaulted, I feel like a lot of us just deny it, and that's what I did for years. It took me actually going to therapy and seeing a sex therapist before I actually used the word assault to describe what happened to me, because I thought I did something wrong in that situation, and it was so embarrassing for me. I thought like, oh, I wasn't being a man, and because I wasn't able to perform, like I did something wrong. But I think a lot of men that have been sexually assaulted don't even realize that what happened to them is being stored as a trauma.
Yeah, that's a good point, because also we have this idea that women can't rape men because, you know, men need to be hard. And if you're hard, then that means that it's consensual. I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think that might also be part of the reason why men are not as open or even like let themselves see whatever they experience as assault. Okay, well, Jess, go for it. Tell us about you after this little deviation to talk about porn.
Yeah, so I grew up in Ohio in a Catholic household, and I went to Catholic school from like kindergarten to my senior year, which was also an all-girls school. And it was super tiny. I mean, I had friends and like social circles outside of that, but it was relatively, you know, sheltered. And my mom is like pretty socially liberal. So it's not like I was in the most conservative household on the planet, but she's also very Catholic. And I definitely remember like abstinence speakers coming into my school when I was in high school. And on my own accord, I just sort of decided that I didn't want to have penetrative sex with anyone until I was in love with them. So I like was physical with some people here and there in like high school and college, but I also lost my virginity with an assault. And it also took me a really long time to realize that that's where it was coming from. And for me, like the person that this encounter occurred with knew that I didn't want to have that experience unless I was in love. So there was just a lot of like mental confusion around what even happened. And then the way that my system chose to process that was a lot of my identity was wrapped around kind of being the virgin in like my high school friend group, and just like this thing that I held with a lot of honor. And so when that happened, the first person that I told about it said congratulations, and she didn't know the details of the story, otherwise she probably wouldn't have said that, but it really silenced what my story was. And so from that point on, for like 6 years, my whole internal like perspective on sex was, okay, well, I'm ruined because this thing happened to me, so now basically like whoever wants to have sex with me can. And then I started dissociating every time I was intimate with someone, so I would like completely black out. And after it got to like a certain level of energy exchange, and I didn't really understand what was going on, but I was a doctor of physical therapy and my specialty was pelvic PT. So as I started working with people, I started working with people who had been raped and assaulted and learned about their dissociation. And once those wheels started spinning, I finally realized like, oh shit, like I actually am dealing with the same thing you are dealing with. I just didn't know it. And so I started processing that. Plant medicine really, really helped me with that process. And at some point on that journey, I found a woman that like the second we met, I was just like, I like love you. And she kind of felt the same. And it was this little whirlwind romance, but I had never dated a woman before. And so that was like a whole other journey taking place simultaneously, where I was just like, for a year, I was like, I'm not bisexual. I just like this one woman. And then I was meditating one day and I had this flood of memories come back of like all of the times being younger where I had fantasized about women and then literally prayed to God that those like quote unquote temptations would be taken away because I thought I was going to go to hell. Sort of intermittently throughout life, I like those fantasies would come back. And probably by the time I was 20, I had like prayed them away enough that I convinced my brain not to think like that. And so when I had this meditation, I was like, oh my God, like interesting. I've always been bisexual. And I just convinced myself like not to be until I met the one woman who like got past that training modality, I guess. So before I met Zach, I had dated a couple of people and there was someone that I expressed to that I was bisexual and it was fine. Like they were accepting whatever. But when I had talked to them about potentially being in an open relationship later, they just like couldn't even handle the concept of it. And so when Zach and I first started seeing each other, something that I had expressed to him is like, hey, like I like women too. And at the end of the day, you don't have the body parts or the same energy that I'm attracted to in that form. And so even though I'm really into you right now, and you're the only person that I want to be with right now, at some point there may be like a woman who enters my life that I just like really want to engage with. And it's important to me to have this conversation up front, because if you're totally close to that idea, like that's kind of a deal breaker for me. And thus began the miscommunications in our relationship. Zach was kind of like, yeah, sure. Like that sounds great. I love every part of you. And I think, I mean, I don't really want to speak for you, but from his perspective, from what we were talking about, he was kind of like, that feels really far in the distance. And I really like this person. So like, sure, whatever. And also it's just going to be a woman. So sure, whatever. And then throughout our relationship, like I started feeling more and more drawn to have the conversation about opening up, but I didn't really feel comfortable bringing it up. And yeah, eventually that resulted in like us not having conversations about boundaries before we should have. And then there was a situation where like we went through quite a tumultuous time because because I hadn't been brave enough to like bring that to the surface, basically.
Right. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about that? Because I heard about that experience from your episode, and I think it's really interesting because it's not like you broke a boundary that you had established, but it's the type of like gray area where a lot of couples often have a really hard time, especially when they open up. And at this point, you guys hadn't even opened up. But, you know, like a lot of couples open up and then one person has one idea of what that means and the other person has a different idea. Tell us about what happened and what you guys learned from that experience.
Yeah. So Jess had left for the jungle. She was training in Peru, and, you know, doing ayahuasca is over the course of 3 nights is no easy feat. Doing it 3 nights in a row with 1 night off over the course of 2 months is extremely difficult. And, you know, inevitably Jess had some difficult nights where she wasn't comfortable going to bed by herself because she was scared. You know, the end of a ayahuasca ceremony could be earth shattering. And then when you're in the middle of the jungle, it could be even more terrifying. And Jess had a brother figure there who just offered a level of intimacy that I have never been comfortable sharing with women or men. And when that level of intimacy was shared with Jess, it really just like shook my foundation. And this level of intimacy was just cuddling. Like in hindsight, it feels so silly to me, but at the time it was such a breach of trust, and it was not something that I was comfortable with.
Yeah. And I think like it's quite the complicated situation, because something worth noting is like, while I'm training in the jungle, there's really no service. And at the place where there is service, it's inconsistent. And also, even though there is service, sometimes it's like you're kind of there to not communicate with the outside world. So I had made this agreement like with myself and with the way that I was studying and connecting with the earth, that I wasn't going to communicate with the outside world for at least the first month. And Zach was like aware of this. But then this situation is unfolding, like this person was providing me a lot of support. And also it was like initially maybe at times when I like really didn't feel comfortable being by myself, but then the lines got blurred where it was like, okay, this was nice. And now I'm like used to this sort of thing. And really, the ideal situation would have been after the first time, I would have contacted Zach and been like, hey, by the way, da da da. And he could have said, no, I'm not cool with that. And the whole thing would have shut off. But because of like what I was going through and not communicating with the outside world, by the time we had this conversation, it had been a month. So like that's definitely like part of the problem. But then also on top of that, like I have always been really comfortable with touch. It's one of the things for my whole life that has been the only thing that eases my anxiety. So like if I know your name, I'm standing next to you, I'm probably touching you unless you've told me not to. And Zach, when we met, wasn't even really comfortable hugging people besides me until he like started breaking through these barriers. So there's a lot that went into how much energy was being carried around this situation. And I had wanted to talk about opening our relationship and boundaries like that July before I went. But because of what Zach was going through, I didn't really feel comfortable. And then when all this stuff happened, it's like, I didn't even really think about it being like something that was going to totally derail our relationship. And if I had just had that conversation with you and we had created clear boundaries, then this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and just to clarify, this person you were cuddling with was just a friend. You had no romantic feelings for him. And I'm not sure if you guys were cuddling after ceremony in the Maloka or if you were cuddling like in private, just the two of you.
So yeah, so most of it was like in the Maloka after ceremony. There was like some private engagement, but it really like that was few and far between it. And I think like what was so hard in our communication of it is like I have had experiences with friends that are purely platonic and not sexual. And also like when you're in the jungle doing this work, part of the work of like deep meditative spiritual work is often learning how to turn off your sexual energy so that you're not like overpowering the energy of the plants or of God or whatever it is that you're connecting with sexual energy. And it's not that sex is demonized or anything. It's just that like, while I'm doing this, I can't be doing that because they're combative energies with each other. So on top of the fact that I really am just friends with this person, like our sexual channels were like totally shut down. And that was just like kind of hard for Zach to understand when we were talking about it. He was just like, but this is a guy. And like, I just know that if you're like cuddling with him, he's thinking other things because you're beautiful. And I'm like, but it's not what's happening. So yeah.
I also want to talk about the way that Zach reacted to that because you are obviously a very sweet, caring partner. And we all have moments losing control because of how you are feeling. And I feel like jealousy is one of those feelings that really kind of overtakes us.
Yeah, when Jess first shared the news, I took it really well. And over the course of like 6 hours, I just kind of like devolved into this insanely jealous, petty person. I just couldn't see the gray area between platonic friendship and a sexual relationship with somebody. In my mind, touch was so closely linked to sexual energy. I was like, there's absolutely no way like this man is going to sleep cuddling my partner and there's no sexual charge. So yeah, I was extremely angry. I would write out like these very, very long messages through WhatsApp. Like, how could you do this? You don't really love me. Like, I have no respect for this man that's doing this. Like, he should have reached out to me and like asked for my permission. And yeah, I would just write these messages and send them off. And like the next morning I would wake up and just be like, oh my God, what have you done? And it was just a roller coaster of I'm okay with this and I love Jess and I'm not okay with this. And she betrayed me. And it was extremely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that you guys couldn't actually like have a proper conversation face to face also made things more difficult. I had a long distance relationship once. He lived in Cuba. I mean, we like literally wrote emails to each other because calling was expensive, and he could only write when he went to his dad's house. We were also going through stuff, and I remember how frustrating it was to have all these feelings and not being able to just call that person up and like have a conversation about it. So I'm sure that that just made everything like so much more difficult. But how did you guys go from there to opening up their relationship?
By the time I was leaving the jungle, it sort of felt like we had worked through it a lot. But then when I got back, it was like, well, we haven't worked through it in person. So now we have to do it all over again. And there would just be like triggers here and there of like, again and again and again, honestly, repeatedly for like months. And then it sort of felt like we were working our way out of it. Like we would come to these places where it was like, okay, we're finally back. And then maybe something else would happen. And we would be like, we weren't actually getting to the place where like we were fully aligned. In the midst of this, we got engaged. So that was like a huge factor where it was like, we know we want to be together. But this isn't really the energy in which we wanted to get engaged in, but it was already planned. And so like that really complicated everything we were processing. And so like eventually at some point in March, we decided like, okay, we're not going to be engaged anymore. Maybe that will relieve some of the pressure. And then I was like, you know, because we got engaged during that time period, I almost feel like I didn't get to choose to be engaged with you. Like it was kind of like, well, I have to say yes because I want to be, but I don't really like feel it right now, you know? And so I was like, maybe I just need to like flirt with other people. Like maybe we can open up just a little bit and I can flirt with other people and that will give me enough energy exchanges elsewhere that like I'll be able to choose you again. And then a week goes by and I'm like, actually, I need to go on dates with other people and like express that way with people. And then a week goes by and I'm like, actually, I think I need to move out. And then a week goes by and I'm like, actually, I think we need to break up. So when we started being open, it actually wasn't like we're together and we're going to open up. Like I realized that even though I was willing to explore other people while we were together, Zach was really in this place of like, if I didn't say, no, we're broken up and you have to assume that we're not getting back together, he wouldn't have explored like dating other people. And I really like knew in my soul that there was just other people that had what I call keys for us that we weren't able to give each other, that if we were ever going to work out, like we needed these keys from other people. And so in order for that to happen, like both of us had to be seeing other people.
What do you mean that people had keys for you guys? And how did you know if you had never been in an open relationship before?
So some of that just comes like from my perspective on life. I really feel like every energy exchange matters. And whether it's like I'm holding the door open for someone or I actually have like an in-depth conversation with someone, like we're all carrying these different energy particles like way far out from our body all the time. And every time particles interact, it shifts them in some capacity. And so I really feel like because of that, every energy exchange matters. And then when you start connecting with people deeper, it's like your energy is really transferring in a totally different way. And so because we had been stuck in this place for so long, it just seemed clear that like we weren't able to shift our particles or whatever enough, or provide each other with the information that we needed to like fully resolve this. And with having our own sexual traumas, something that was really, really beautiful about like Zach and Jess 1.0, as we like to call it, is that because we had this understanding of what each other had been through, we were able to be like extremely patient and compassionate with each other when we were being physically intimate. And so there were so many times where I would realize that like, okay, Zach, I'm not feeling my legs anymore. Like we need to stop being intimate so that I can get back in my body. And there was a lot of like being in the middle of something and slowing down, or maybe being in the middle of something and stopping, and me like learning not to feel guilt for saying no, or like I have to pause halfway through, sorry. And by way of having that space and creating that space for each other, we really got to heal like those traumas in a way that I never would have been able to, or Zach wouldn't have been able to by himself. But because we were so like loving and compassionate with each other in that space, it felt like we weren't then able to like break through this barrier to then access other types of sexual energy exchange.
Right, like healing is not necessarily sexy, right?
Exactly. And it like was amazing because we wouldn't be able to access the other stuff.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Healing is beautiful, but one thing is beautiful, another thing is sexy, and you probably want both things, right?
Exactly. It's like people want to make love and they also want to fuck. And like they're not really the same energy. And it's also a spectrum and there's some crossover, but it's like because so much of our experience had been based on allowing each other to heal, it's like we couldn't cross through that threshold. So besides feeling like people had keys for us just like intellectually and emotionally, that would occur in the space that we were taking, it was also like really strongly related to sexual experience. It's like I feel like if we just were intimate with like one other person each, even though it ended up being more for Zach, like it only really took one person for each of us to like flip the switch for us to be able to access that alternative energy. And
yeah, and also, I mean, sounds like you were feeling a little like suffocated, right? Like you were like, oh, now we gotta get married, and now I cannot really express my desires because how could I ask him to be open if we're still getting over that I cuddled with this guy, right? So like, I think it was also you like trying to trying to like escape a little bit and get some freedom and independence. But yeah, I'm interested to hear, Zach, how did you react when she told you that, or when you guys broke up, and how did things move from there?
Yeah, I did not carry the same knowing that other people had keys for us. And because of my sexual history, I didn't think being open or poly was for me because it would take me so long to become comfortably or sexually comfortable with somebody. I was like, there's no way I could be open because it takes months for me to like build up that emotional trust to have sex with somebody. So I was devastated. When Jess moved out, I was like, everything's going to be okay. When I saw her car in the driveway one day when I wasn't expecting her, I already knew what was going to happen before I entered the door. And I was really crushed when we broke up. But also at that time, because I felt like I couldn't be in an open relationship, it did feel very clean is the word I want to use to let her go and explore that, because I just knew like it was something she had to explore. And I also just felt like we couldn't be in a relationship while she was doing that because I was just too sensitive. So yeah, I was really crushed. And there's a difference between making love and fucking. And my entire sexual resume in the past was only making love because I was so uncomfortable carrying dark sexual energy. Like it made me feel unsafe. Even if it was wanted from my partner, I just could not harness it. So like just said, like this rift with us sexually was also a big part of us breaking up. And again, when Jess left, I was like, okay, I need to focus on like what needs to be healed within me so that I don't make the same mistake again. And just like when I went through that divorce, I was like, okay, I need to like uncover this sexual dysfunction that I feel that I have. When Jess left, I was like, okay, I need to turn on the dark sexual energy and be able to harness this. I want to be able to tap into it and I want to be able to provide that for a partner, but I just couldn't. So I downloaded Field, and so I was like, where do I meet people that are open or poly? Because I didn't want to just jump into another relationship. And I also wanted to learn more about the lifestyle. I just wanted to meet other women or other couples that had the same expansive view of what love and intimacy can be. So I start going on dates, and all this healing that Jess and I had done sexually transferred over to me finally being confident enough sexually to go on a date. And if a woman invited me back to her place or if I invited her back to mine, then I trusted my body enough to perform sexually. So even though when Jess was like, other people have keys for us, and I was like, yeah, that's fucking bullshit. Nobody has keys for me. They really like these experiences that I had with these other women. Those were the keys. Like I needed to experience that that trust in my body to perform. I don't even like to use the word perform, just be able to like to fuck, it was just like I was, for the first time in my life, I was able to have sex with a stranger that I was attracted to without any like unneeded pressure that I was putting on myself or anxiety. And it was like really beautiful. And my relationship with myself sexually totally changed after that. And this was the first time I would have sex with somebody and be like, okay, that was fun. And I never need to see you again. And that's okay. And being able to have that experience really opened my mind to what physical intimacy can be. It's like, oh, I can have sex with somebody and not immediately fall in love with them. A lot of people may listen to this and be like, oh, how healing can a one night stand be, or how healing could like quote unquote promiscuous sex be. But for me, it was extremely healing, and it taught me to love myself and express love in a very different way that in the past I was not comfortable doing.
Yeah. I do think that it can be like a confidence booster, right? Because when you go and see other people being attracted to you, or simply when you go on a date with someone that you don't know that well, it kind of like helps you see yourself through different eyes and like feel confident if you feel connected towards someone and they feel connected to you. And of course, it's not like you cannot have that inside of your relationship, but it's very easy for us as humans to get very content and like kind of like it's the same all the time and it's monotonous, and just going out and having a date can spark the fire in your own relationship.
It's funny because as he's telling this story, I'm like recalling after like the first time he was with someone, we like got dinner or you took me to get food, some pick up food or something, but he like told me this while I was waiting in line to get my food, and I was literally like, yes, like totally abnormal reaction from an ex, but I'm so proud of you and I'm so happy that you got to have that experience.
What did he tell you exactly?
I think it was just like I had sex with someone and I didn't like have performance anxiety, and I like was able to perform in a way that like I'm really happy with, and I could just tell that he was like proud of his body and like the way that the interaction went. And later there was like a conversation or two where more specifics about one girl or another was shared, and I was just like, ick, I don't know if I want to hear that. But in that particular experience, like because I knew how meaningful that would be for him and how healing that was for him, I was just like so happy that he got to have that experience.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And how did you guys go from that to getting back together?
It was quite a process. It wasn't like, I was able to tap into this energy and Jess saw me in a different light. I really had to give Jess, I was still completely in love with her, and I felt to my core that she was my person. And I also had to give her space and respect that space, which is really difficult for me because I definitely have an anxious attachment style. So even though I was like having these amazing sexual experiences with other women, emotionally, I was still very raw. And there were so many times where I just wanted to like reach out to her, call her, text her, or like see her. And I just didn't. I felt like I just had to be strong and give her the space and allow her to come back to me. So we, would see each other here and there, but we weren't like, our goal was not to like immediately just get back together. It took a while to get there.
Yeah. And a big piece of this story, which we sort of like left out because it's not totally related to the opening and closing of it, is that there was like a long period of the first part of our relationship where I felt like I was holding a lot of space for Zach that he wasn't able to hold for himself. So then when we went through this whole process with like the jungle and stuff, that's really when I reached my capacity, is just like, I can't hold this space for you anymore, because now that with this is like too much. So while he was doing his thing when we were broken up, I like met someone who's in an open relationship almost like immediately and who had a primary. These people that had been doing open relating for a while, and they were a really solid couple, and actually we're both really good friends with them now. I got to kind of have a safe haven with that person for a little while. And then really like what allowed me to come back to Zach was like all of the work that he did, you know, like in addition to just like hooking up with women that weren't me, he was like studying all the time how to like get rid of the insecurities that had led to the issues within our relationship. And so he like read a bunch of different books about how to be more secure in a relationship and things like that. And then like found your podcast and listened to a lot of those episodes, which really helped. And a lot of what I now know about like how to be in a successful open relationship comes from the information that Zach actually learned. You know, I'm kind of like, I love everyone and it will just work out. And Zach's like, I need to know how to do this, you know, and like that really helped us. And just by way of us slowly starting to interact again, I got to really witness like how he was starting to show up for himself in a different way because he was holding that space for himself when he was going through like difficult days instead of like reaching out and just dumping on me. And we had bought tickets to Lightning in a Bottle Festival. And so we were broken up, but we had decided to still go in May. And Zach did this like really beautiful, like little ceremony in our tent that just expressed to me like his gratitude to me for, you know, the shifts that I was able to create for him and just what our relationship was. And a lot of that expression of love was much more like, no matter what happens, like I'll always be here for you. Like I'll always be your safe space. And like, who knows what if we're going to come back together, but like, I'm never going to leave you. And it's really like what I needed to hear to start opening up to him. Like, okay, I can have Zach in my life forever. And it doesn't have to be a relationship. It doesn't have to be a monogamous relationship. Like, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I can start exploring him in my life again without trying to fit him into this hole. And yeah, slowly but surely we like reunited in a way where we were like, we're definitely each other's people. So now what?
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like, you know, when he gave you unconditional love, that's when you were like, okay, this feels right. I wanted Zach to talk about how being in an open relationship made you feel more secure.
Well, Jess and I were broken up and I started to go on dates and have sex with different women. I started to open up to the idea of like, hey, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can be in an open relationship. But what do I have to do in order to do this successfully? And it just kept coming back to learning to love myself and accept myself for who I am. And that was something that was like in my opinion, like kind of the demise of our first relationship is I didn't trust myself and I was extremely hard on myself and I just would get in these negative thought loops and I just stopped accepting that and I started to love myself unconditionally. And by proxy was able to understand and love Jess unconditionally. So now I am in an open relationship, but it's the most secure I've ever been because I know no matter what happens with Jess and I won't abandon myself and I will always be able to provide the love that I need for myself. And I'm not handing over the reins or giving all that power to my partner. It's like I harness it for myself. If I was going to choose Jess for everything that she is and will be, I had to first unconditionally love myself because that's what our partners need from us. And if you can't provide it for yourself, how can you provide it for your partner?
Yeah, for sure. And another reason why you were open to being open was because of your experience meeting this man that just started dating that also had a primary. So can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah. So in the past, anytime Jess had ever expressed physical intimacy with a platonic male friend, it would trigger so much jealousy within me. Like even just holding a hand with somebody that I deeply love and trust would get to me. So going into meeting Jess's male partner, because Jess cared for him so much, I trusted that he was like a pretty good guy, but also I was still going into meeting him with some hesitation and with some jealousy and being like, what does this guy have that I don't? Um, but then when I met him, he was I saw so much of myself in him. And when I say that, I mean like I saw the love that he had for Jess, and I felt that she was safe with him. And because of that, it just really melted away any like insecurity or fear that I had about Jess being with this person. And he's he's just like a great guy, and it's like somebody that I'm friends with now. When I met him, I was like, I think I could be friends with this guy. And I'm very selective about like who I choose to like bring into my life. So I am like extremely grateful that was the person that Jess chose, or they chose each other, they found each other, however you want to phrase it. Because if I had sat down across from another man who didn't respect Jess or love Jess or feel a need to hold her heart in the way that I do, that could have been the end of me exploring an open relationship. And I just feel extremely grateful to this person that he was the one.
Yeah, and that also says a lot about you, right? Because instead of liking him and thinking, oh, he has all these things that I don't have, and getting into your head about it and making it about you and your ego, you were like, he cares for Jess and I care for her too. Like, we're on the same team. And, that really goes to show that, like, you are not selfishly relating to Jess, but that you are actually like caring for her.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a beautiful moment for sure.
So, how long ago was that, and how have things progressed from there? Jess, are you still seeing dating this person, or are you just friends at this point?
So it's interesting. What seemed to happen is as Zach and I recalibrated towards each other, both of our desires to like explore with other people kind of settled. And so I just recently had a conversation with this person actually to like fully like make sure we were on the same page. But technically, Zach and I still consider ourselves open, and we don't really have like any boundaries on our relationship other than if there's someone that either of us is interested in, like tell each other first. But because we're in this transition phase of like, okay, fully being back together, I just moved in fully 2 weeks ago. It feels like our hearts and like bodies and minds really just want to, like, if we're not doing other things for business or school or socially, like, we really just want to be together. And so, like, my thoughts on this person in particular, because they're definitely going to be in our lives forever, just as like friends anyway, is that our connection may sort of like come in and out of life in its intensity or like shape shift in whatever is relevant to the moment. Both of us really honored the intensity at which we connected at the time. And I got so many gifts and understandings from him, and like how him and his partner make their relationship work and like do open relating so honorably. And then, the way that he expresses it is just that like I had a really positive impact on the changes that he was able to make in the past few months too. And so it really feels like the intensity at which we came together, like physically and emotionally and energetically, was with purpose to like create these massive shifts within each other. And so we still love each other and we're still attracted to each other, but the desire right now just isn't really present because we're doing other stuff. And so currently Zach and I are only seeing each other. But again, like, we have the freedom to see other people. It's just not where our energy is tracking right now.
Yeah, which I think that it's beautiful that you guys are able to recognize kind of the fluid nature of relationships, and to be open to do whatever feels right instead of like forcing a specific relationship structure. You guys like obviously have done a lot of work, and yeah. And how about Zach? Have you been dating, or I mean, before you guys closed, or well, momentarily closed right now as you like move back together?
No, I haven't. What actually happened with me is I got polysaturated. I I was going out on so many dates and having sex with so many different women. It actually got to a point to where I just felt like really depleted. And when I got to that point, I was like, you know what? I am just going to focus on myself, focus on school, and focus on, building this relationship, this new relationship with Jess again. And uh, yeah, I haven't dated anybody in a while, but that was the culmination of really exploring to the fullest extent what being solo poly is like. And that was a really beautiful lesson because I realized I don't have the emotional capacity to be connecting with so many different women over the course of a week or a month or multiple months.
Yeah, I'm glad that you had that period because I feel like that's somewhat important to kind of know what you like, know what you don't like. But yeah, I'm also glad that you guys are also listening to what your relationship needs and just being closed for the time being. Is there anything you guys want to add before the last question?
I just like to throw this in there. The first time Jess and I had sex when we came back together was the best sex I've ever had in my entire life. I didn't have any toys on me, but I grabbed my belt, I tied her up, and it was hot. And it was like,
Amazing.
yeah, it was the first time she got to experience that. It was the first time I got to experience it with her. And it was like, whew, it was hot.
Thanks for that.
Oh, amazing. I mean, I like that you added that because it just goes to show that the work does pay off, and obviously you have both done a lot of work on yourself. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what's really important. If there's communication and willingness to change and evolve, I feel like couples can overcome everything. Also, the experience that you both have had, because that's another thing, right? Like, the more people you have sex with, the more experience you have, and the more like tricks you learn, and the more things that you can like bring into your relationship. But so you guys did manage to go from the beautiful to the sexy. So that's gonna be the end of the story for this episode. But before we wrap up, yeah, what would you guys tell to a polycurious person, to the listeners who might just be starting to explore? What do you wish that you knew when you started?
I would recommend to focus on the relationship with yourself because if you are not already giving yourself the nourishing love that you need when your partner is expressing love to somebody else, whatever you're already not feeling is just going to compound. So I would just say really take responsibility for providing the love that you need within the relationship. Don't put it on your partner.
And then for me, it's kind of like polycurious or poly or monogamous or whatever you are. Like, I feel like having conversations about your boundaries and what your ideal relationship looks like is essential and is something that, when you're in an open relationship and a poly relationship, that just kind of comes naturally. But it's a shame that that's not like the norm for everyone across the board, because that's really like where all of our stuff started, is us not having those conversations of like, are you cool if we cuddle other people? Are you cool if we do this with other people? Like from the get-go. And something that I've noticed with like couples that we've like started coaching or consulted with is that they start exploring the poly world, maybe even just a little bit, but they haven't talked about like what they are wanting. They just start dating someone, and then one person wants that third person to be a certain thing to them, and the other person wants that person to be something else. And it's like, you sort of don't know exactly what you want until you start exploring. But it's good to like be on the same page, either really clear with yourself if you're solo poly, or like on the same page with your partner from the get-go. And then if you want to change from there, it's fine. But like, you can really save a lot of hardship and headaches if there's some clarity from the start.
That's an excellent point because, yeah, we often don't have those conversations. And even if you have the conversation of, oh, I want to open up, okay, me too. What does that actually mean, right? And even if you don't know exactly, because you can only know through experience, you can talk about what that would look like, even in theory. So yeah, I think what you guys both said are great tips. And thank you guys so much for being so open and vulnerable, and for all your wisdom this episode.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for listening to today's episode. If you want to connect with Jess and Zach, you can find them on Instagram at sacred_ships, or follow the link in the show notes. There you can also find a link to their podcast, where I was a guest last year, in case you are interested to check that out. If you enjoyed this episode and thought of a friend of yours who might find it helpful, please don't forget to share it with them. And of course, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any of our episodes. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you all next week.